All right, now we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello to all. Thank you for joining today's BIOMIN Antibiotic Reduction Expert Series. I'm your moderator today. My name is Ryan Hines. I'm the Communications Manager at BIOMIN. Now, our topic today is Zero Zinc, an update on the Danish strategy to replace zinc oxide. And I have the pleasure of being joined today by our featured expert, Dr. Christian Fink Hansen, the Director at SEGES, Danish Pig Research Center. Dr. Fink Hansen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Ryan. Pleased to be here.
We're very glad that you will share some insights with us pretty soon in today's session. Now, you are a nutritionist by background. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work at SEGES?
Yeah, my name is Christian Fink Hansen. I'm the director at the Pig Research Center at SEGES. We are around 150 people dedicated to applied research within all aspects of pig production. We are responsible for running the Danbred breeding program, setting the breeding growth for Danbred, and we also run veterinary services for the Danish pig producers, including having our own laboratory for pig diseases.
Excellent. And being in that position gives you the opportunity to share some very insightful information with our audience today. Right before we get to that, though, I did want to remind everyone in the audience that today this is an interactive session. So in this digital experience, you have the opportunity to submit your questions for Dr. Fink Hansen using the chat function that you see on your screen. You can simply type that in and hit submit. And at the end of the tail end of our session, we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can, time permitting. So please go ahead and send those through. We're also going to be able to get your involvement and participation through audience poll questions. And so with that, at several points throughout today's remarks, we're going to put some questions up and ask you to submit your answers to them. So please look for that later on. And without further ado, we're going to go ahead and begin today's session. So please, Dr. Fink Hansen, begin your presentation.
Yes, thank you, Ryan. We'll go straight into it, and I will today try to give you an update on the Danish strategies of what we are working on nutritional wise to replace zinc oxide. We have a hard deadline in June 2022. Medical zinc will be banned within the EU, and we can no longer use that in the Danish pig production. So we have set up an action plan, and our goal with that plan is to be able to phase out medical zinc oxide without having a negative effect on animal welfare, mainly meaning that we don't want to increase frequency of post-weaning diarrhea. And at the same time, we want to maintain a low and prudent antibiotic usage, and we want to do it without having a negative effect on productivity and mortality. So to achieve that, we have set up some action points. We invest heavily in research and development. Today, we're mainly going to talk about nutrition, but it's a multidisciplinary approach we're taking also together with all other Danish collaborators. We also have huge focus on communication because we are paid by the Danish pig producers. So all the new knowledge that we obtain, that needs to be implemented in the field, needs to be taken up by the Danish pig producers for us to be successful. And phasing out zinc oxide, that's an urgent issue not only in Denmark but for all EU member states. So therefore, we're also taking an international approach to try and solve this problem. And just to give you a bit of background, the two figures here. One shows the consumption of medical zinc in Danish pig production. The bars shows the total zinc consumption, and the line shows the amount of zinc oxide or medical zinc used per piglet. And as you can see, we see a reduction in the use of medical zinc in Denmark, even though we still have a long way to go before we have completely removed it from the Danish pig production. The other figure shows antimicrobial usage in Danish pig production. It has a lot of attention from the public in Denmark, and phasing out zinc oxide without increasing the antimicrobial usage with the current conditions in Denmark, that is a must. However, the reduction I just showed you, that is mainly driven by a study I will share with you in a few minutes, where we showed that reducing medical zinc levels from 2,500 parts per million down to 1,500 parts per million, we were able to do that and at the same time have the same productivity and antimicrobial usage or treatments against diarrhea. This has been implemented on many Danish farms, resulting in the reduction that I just showed you. We are still in a situation where few farms have fully phased out the use of medical zinc.
Now that's an interesting comment right there, and if I could use that as an opportunity to conduct our first audience poll that we spoke about earlier. So you mentioned that. Let's have a look and get a feeling for where everyone stands on their own use of zinc oxide. So how would you characterize your current zinc oxide use? Now, for those of you listening in our live audience, please go ahead and select the one best answer that suits your situation. Either you do not currently use medicinal zinc, you have started to reduce zinc use, you're looking at maintaining essentially your current level of zinc use, you're using more than in the past, or not sure. And as we get those votes in, we've already had a good portion of our audience weigh in. We're going to have a look, and we're going to be able to share those results and see how everyone stands on the topic. So now we have nearly half of everyone listening has voted. So I'm going to go ahead and close that poll now, and then we'll have a look. Thank you for everyone who's shared your opinion. Here are the results of the voting. We have about 1/5 who do not use medicinal zinc. 44% have started to reduce zinc oxide use. A quarter are maintaining. No one is increasing. And there's a little bit of uncertainty as to whether some are using zinc oxide in their systems or not. Dr. Fink Hansen, how does that look to you? Is that something that you commonly encounter when you're discussing this topic? The sort of progress on a reduction?
As I mentioned, this is an issue all over Europe. I would say that, yes, I showed you we are reducing, but it's mainly driven by a reduction in the dosage. I would say between 5 to 10% of the Danish piggeries have fully phased out zinc oxide, which is a bit lower than the number you showed. But again, I know that there's huge sort of geographical differences among the different European countries.
Absolutely, and I know everyone is keen to hear more about how to make those make that progress and to get those levels down. So please carry on with your comments.
Yes. So weaning without zinc oxide, well, weaning in general to avoid post-weaning diarrhea, that's multifactorial and it's complex. Management, the disease pressure in the herd, how is the climate, how is the pen design, what is the quality of the piglets at weaning, that all impacts how easy it is or how difficult it is to be able to phase out medical zinc. However, feed, that is one of the most important factors which lead us to sort of discussing of which feeding strategies can then best help us when the aim is to phase out zinc and try to prevent post-weaning diarrhea. So if we look at feeding in general, what is sort of then the best tools that we have in the toolbox? As I mentioned, the quality of the piglets at weaning is important, which means that also sow feeding is a topic that should be discussed, or you should check to ensure that you get high quality pigs at weaning. So sow feeding with the aim of achieving a high milk yield is something that needs to be considered. The discussion of how to supplement, or if you should supplement in the farrowing pen, restricted feeding post-weaning, of course low protein diets, which I will spend a fair amount of time on today, is important. The buffering capacity or calcium levels of the diet, which feed ingredients, what is the digestibility of those ingredients that you're using, and of course feed additives are all important. Traditionally, when we do research, we conduct research, we investigate sort of one factor at a time, and we compare that then to a positive or a negative control group. Here I've shown the design of the trial I described earlier. So we had a negative control group, no added medical zinc, and then 2 levels of zinc oxide. So a negative control, a positive control, and then in this study we also included other dietary interventions. We have done a lot of those types of study. This is another way of showing it. 6 different treatment groups, and then a 3-stage feeding program in the nursery period. What is important, or what I want to emphasize, is that when I'm talking about medical zinc, it's only medical zinc or high levels of zinc oxide in the phase 1 or the stage 1 diet in approximately the 2 first weeks post weaning. And as I mentioned, the conclusion of this study was that yes, we could reduce from 2,500 down to 1,500 parts per million medical zinc with identical productivity and treatments for diarrhea. In this study, we didn't see any effect of the 3 other alternative products. And we have seen that not only in this study, but in a substantial amount of studies that we have done. This means that when we are discussing phasing out zinc oxide, I don't think that we will be able to find just one silver bullet that will be able to replace zinc oxide or medical zinc one-to-one. There's one thing that can do it, that's antibiotics, but as I mentioned, that is not an option, that's not a solution in the Danish situation. So if I don't think there's going to be just one silver bullet, what was then the next approach that we took after we have done a lot of research, a lot of trials looking for that silver bullet? We decided to collaborate with different companies, and we selected 4 sort of 4 different concepts. We were interested in that if we included different interventions, whether then an additive effect of working with reducing the protein content, working with the amino acid profiles, adding organic acid, probiotics, fibers, enzymes, adding organic acids, etc., to the drinking water. If we use a combination of intervention, could that then help us solve the problem? And we compared that towards our control diets based on wheat, barley, soya protein concentrate, soybean meal, potato protein, and fish meal. And again, as in all the trials that I'll present for you today, we had this 3-stage feeding program, or three phases in the nursery period. So 6 groups in a trial. We then went down on replicate 63 reps, more than 4,000 pigs in this study. What I want to emphasize is that group 2, that was a negative control, no medical zinc, and our positive control, medical zinc, high dosage of zinc oxide, were only included in the phase 1 period. In phase 2 and phase 3, the diets were identical in the positive and the negative control, whereas in the different concepts groups there were dietary interventions in all three phases. Coming to the production results, daily gain and feed efficiency. In one of the concepts, we actually saw a higher daily gain and a better feed conversion ratio compared to the positive control group with zinc oxide added. Here we looked at over the entire trial period from weaning until approximately 30 kilos. And we had another concept where performance levels, daily gain, feed efficiency were at the same level as the positive control group. Looking at diarrhea treatments, we saw the same pattern. In one of the concepts, we actually saw a lower number of diarrhea treatments compared to the positive control, and in another group, we saw diarrhea treatments at the same level as our positive control group. This next slide, it's a bit busy, but what it shows is that on the x-axis we have the days after weaning, and on the y-axis we have the number of diarrhea treatments, and then the lines here that shows the different dietary phases. And please remember, medical zinc diets or zinc levels were only included here in the control group in the phase 1 diet. So the red line here, that is the negative control, no added zinc oxide. But please pay attention to that a lot of the diarrhea treatments actually comes after the first 2 weeks post-weaning. The blue line shows the number of diarrhea treatments in the positive control. There's a substantial or significantly lower number of diarrhea treatments when the pigs were fed phase 2 and phase 3 diets, but the zinc was included here. So there is a carryover effect, so to speak, on diarrhea treatments of including medical zinc in the immediate post-weaning period. And as with the 2 successful concepts that we tested, they were lower in diarrhea treatments in all 3, or in phase 2 and in phase 3. Looking at the cost of the concept, because looking at it from a commercial point of view, we found that yes, these 2 concepts seems promising, seems to work, but when we do the financial or the economic calculations, evaluations, they were still on the expensive side. So to conclude on this concept study, removal of zinc oxide from the feed that lowered sort of our production value by 26 euro cents per pig. The effect on productivity or treatment for diarrhea, yes, we had 2 concepts that were promising, but looking from a financial point of view, I don't think, perhaps with the current high prices that we have, it might be viable, but when prices are lower, it's still expensive compared to the other just using zinc. So after we did this study, this is some of the thoughts that we have that led on to the research that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So zinc cannot be replaced just by a single compound. We don't think there's going to be, or we will ever find this silver bullet. The effects observed in the trials or the information that I just shared with you, they will likely or could likely be attributed to a low protein content, a combination of feed additives, low calcium content, and to different amino acid profiles. So zinc and weaning, when we looked at the diarrhea pattern that I also shared with you, we have zinc in the weaning period that sort of has a carryover effect. If we are going to be successful with nutritional interventions or measures, we need to include those measures, those interventions in the entire nursery period to be successful. So we decided that we wanted to continue working with reducing the protein levels in the nursery period. Why did we choose that? That was a common thing that was in the different concepts that we tested. Our idea was, could we then sort of then take those concepts apart, and when we move or sort of take those concepts apart, can we then make them cheaper? Can we then make them more sort of commercially attractive to the pig producers? We choose to work with reduced protein because if we reduce the amount of undigested protein entering the hindgut of the pig, that will likely reduce the risk of osmotic diarrhea. We can lower, we can never prevent, but we can lower protein fermentation, which by then reduce the amount of microbial metabolites which can damage the intestinal epithelium, and thereby we want to reduce the risk of colonization of the intestine with E. coli. That's all well and good, but we also know that that can happen when we play, or if we get the amino acid balance incorrect. If we reduce protein levels too much, that will have a negative impact on productivity, on performance. So the first study, the results I'm going to share with you today, we reduced the protein levels, and the aim of the study was to test 4 different strategies for reducing protein content in the diet post-weaning, and we compared that with a positive and a negative control group. Our hypothesis was that medical zinc will reduce diarrhea treatments by 35% compared to a negative control or no zinc group, and that reducing protein content would have the same effect, but we wanted to quantify to what extent that would lower daily gain in the nursery period. So the trial design, we had 6 treatment groups, 75 reps per treatment group, close to 7,000 piglets on trial, weaned at between 25 to 27 days, weighing in the interval from 5.5 to 9 kilograms. We did the study in our experimental herd using Dan-bred pigs and fed them a pelleted diet. Again, we used 3 phases in the nursery period. In the 2 control groups, in all 3 phases, the pigs or the protein levels were according to norm or according to the current Danish recommendations. In group 3, we went low in protein in phase 1, and then fed according to requirement or current recommendations in Denmark in phase 2 and 3. In group 4, we went low in protein in both phase 1 and phase 2, and then high or higher than the recommendations in phase 3 to see if the pigs could then compensate in the third phase. In group 5, we went very low in phase 1 and then high in phase 2 and 3. In group 6, we went very low in phase 1, sort of intermediate or medium in phase 2, and then high in the third phase. Feed formulations, we used the same level of soybean meal in all groups, so 7% in phase 1, 14 in phase 2, and 21 in phase 3. The reduction in protein was then achieved by reducing the amount of soybean protein concentrate, potato protein, and fish meal in the diets. Coming to the results, looking in the over the entire trial period, looking at diarrhea treatments, we saw a 50% reduction in diarrhea treatments by including zinc oxide in the diet. Looking at or comparing group 4 with the positive, or sort of the negative control group, there was a lower number of diarrhea treatments around the 25% mark. Coming to performance results, and this is in the phase 1 or immediately post weaning. In this study, we didn't see a difference in between the positive and negative control when looking at daily gain and feed conversion ratios. We quite often see that when working with medical zinc oxide, and that has to do with how good your staff is at treating at the right time. Looking at group 3 and 4, the two groups where we went low in phase 1, no effect on daily gain, but a poor feed conversion ratios in those two groups compared to the negative control. And looking at the group 5 and 6, where we went very low, we saw both a lower daily gain and a poor feed conversion ratio in those groups. If you look at the overall period, no difference. Also, no difference between the positive and the negative control. However, still a slightly lower daily gain in group 4 compared to the negative control. And if we looked at group 6, we saw the same pattern with a lower daily gain. So what did we find? We found that the best strategies was going low in phase 1 and 2, and then high in phase 3. Thereby, we were able to reduce the treatment days by 25% compared to the negative control, but it came at a cost of reduction in daily gain by 15 grams. So why did we not see a greater effect on diarrhea by lowering protein content in the diet? Well, our protein levels were 19, 16.5, and 14% in the different phases respectively. Whereas if we looked if you look at the scientific literature, where there's also been reports of an effect of lowering protein contents. Some of this research I was involved in earlier in my career, working out of Australia. Their starting points, what they call high protein diets, they were much higher compared to what we started with in our study. So the 19% that was high in our study, that was actually in comparing to the scientific literature, that was low protein diets. So I think that is one of the explanations that we saw a smaller effect than what previously has been reported in the scientific literature. So to conclude, medical zinc reduced diarrhea treatments by around 50% compared with no zinc. Low protein diets, they work, but they are not as good as including zinc oxide in the diet. And low protein diets, unfortunately, means lower productivity. It can be partly compensated by subsequent higher protein levels, but nonetheless there is a lower productivity. We still believe that reducing protein plays a role in the solution when we want to phase out zinc oxide, and we have published new Danish recommendations on what the protein levels should be in phase 1 and 2 if you want to phase out zinc oxide. We currently run studies with where we continue to work with low protein diets, but where we also work with different feed ingredients, and we have some really interesting results on the way that will be available towards the end of this year. So this was sort of a status on where we are research wise in Denmark when we discuss diet formulations. Now I want to share some field experiences with you from farms, piggeries in Denmark that wean without medical or using medical zinc oxide. We have set up this project where the purpose is that we want to try to identify common features in piggeries that wean without the use of medical zinc oxide. The farms that participate, we have recruited them mainly through our network of field veterinarians, and then we have interviewed the farm owners with respect to management, health status, looking at how they feed, what is the hygiene levels, what type of personnel are they using. And we have collected data from some of the national databases that are available regarding antibiotic usage on those piggeries. We have collected their feed recipes. We look at their production reports and also on their vaccination schemes. Currently, we have 26 herds participating in this project. In total, they produce around 600,000 weaners per year. There's quite a difference in size of those herds. If we look at their production results, daily gain, on average they are at 462 grams, which is actually spot on the national average we have in Denmark. The average weaner mortality is at 2.1%, which is a bit lower than our national average, which is around the 3% mark. I just want to, just for information, to share what is the antibiotic usage in those 26 herds. The yellow line that marks when the authorities actually gives those piggeries above the yellow line a yellow card, meaning that they can put interventions or on those piggeries to force them to reduce their antibiotic usage. The national average in Denmark is around 10 ADDs per 100 animals. So just to show you that among those herds, there's quite a variation in their antibiotic usage, from some piggeries that hardly use any antibiotics to piggeries that use actually more antibiotics than that is the national average in Denmark. A common approach in all those farms is that they work with the protein levels in their diets, but it varies quite substantially how much or how low they go in their protein levels. Another common approach among those 26 farms is that they are very interested in measures that will increase feed intake immediately post weaning. So in the post weaning period, a lot of them they use floor feeding. They add extra troughs. A few of them use gruel feed, etc. But almost all of them work with increasing feed intake immediately post weaning. And another common approach that we found, and this has nothing to do with feeding or diet formulation, is that they have trained personnel. On the majority of the 26 farms, more precise, on 20 out of the 26 farms, the manager of the piglets had been employed at that farm for more than a year. And also what tends to pattern that we saw, that the manager of the piglets had worked with piglets for more than 3 years. So they have experienced staff, and they have a low turnover of staff. And in many cases, that might actually be more important than what is the exact protein content or protein level in the diets that they're using. So high quality labor. So coming towards the end, controlling post-weaning diarrhea, I don't think that there will be one common solution. Why do I not believe that? Well, if you look at the predetermining factors, that's genetics, that's the immune status, that's weaning age, that is how much anorexia will there be post-weaning. Of course, we know the determining factor, that'll be a toxin-producing E. coli. But the contributing factors, housing conditions, stocking density, feeding regime, co-infections, all of that will vary from piggery to piggery. So to sum up, the goal that still is that we want to find cost-effective solution without increasing antibiotic usage. It's not an easy task for the majority of the Danish farms, and we currently, as I mentioned, have between 5 to 10% of the farms that produce without zinc oxide, meaning we still have a long way to go over the next couple of years. So zinc is still a common approach to control post-weaning diarrhea in Denmark. We see a drop in zinc usage, but it's a reduction in doses that is the main driver. And farms that produce without medical zinc oxide, they use low protein diets, they focus on feed intake immediately post-weaning, and they have trained personnel with a long employment period. They have stability among their staff. So unfortunately, I don't think there will be no We are not going to find one common solution. Each piggery, each farmer will need to learn and find out what is working at his or her farm. So with that, thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to try and answer any questions you might have, Ryan.
Excellent. Thank you for those remarks. You've covered a lot of ground. And before we get to the questions to you, we're going to turn the tables on our audience once more and ask them something. We're going to check right now into our second audience poll question. How well prepared are you for meeting the 2022 phase out of zinc? Based on your feeling, please select the one answer that best applies to your situation. Do you feel well prepared, somewhat prepared, not prepared, or is it not applicable? Are you not required to phase out zinc because you're outside of the EU, for example? And I'm certain that the number who are prepared is ticked up over the past 40 minutes of remarks. Dr. Hansen's insights into how to manage this successfully. But let us go ahead and read out the results of that poll. Thank you for everyone who participated. Here is what our audience has to say. We have 19% are well prepared, a full half are somewhat prepared, 12% not prepared, and 1/5, interestingly enough, interested in this topic, but outside of the European Union, so not required to phase out zinc. Great. Is there anything that strikes you about those numbers, that people are starting to make the progress and start to reduce dosages primarily, as you've indicated, or is it very, very different from farm to farm?
I think it's very well. If we take out the 20% that is outside the EU, I think it still describes pretty good the situation that we have in Denmark. It's on the agenda for everyone. You have not the majority, but at least you have, let's say, 25% of the farmers. Oh, the neighbor will solve that for me. And then we have currently a small group of producers that can do this successfully. Some of them, they have to use more antibiotics, unfortunately, and therefore I'm still a bit concerned that what will happen in June in 2 years' time, what will happen to our antibiotic usage?
Yes.
Because again, if we see an increase, that will put substantial pressure on the industry. So I hope that we can, over the coming years, more and more, better and better, sort of mobilize the entire sector, mobilize the pig producers, mobilize the feed industry, all of us working together with the veterinarians, experiment on the different farms, what can work and what cannot work on the different farms. Because, as I said, this is multifactorial. What is the disease pressure? What vaccines are you using? That all plays a role in this puzzle.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that this is coming up in 2022. How set in stone do you believe that is, or would you anticipate any changes, loosening of the legislation, or is it time to buckle down and get to work with some of that experimentation?
For my chair, that is cast in stone. It's time to buckle up, get to work, get your hands dirty, if you like. On June 2022, I don't hope that the shit is going to hit the fan. We are working very hard that that's not going to happen, but we have a hard deadline, and that's not going to change. I don't believe that.
Certainly something that will keep minds focused on this topic. And you've already shared a number of, let's say, key success factors that you've seen there. Let's get to some of the other questions that have been submitted during today's discussion. So the one I have for you now is, how common is it to raise pigs without zinc entirely? in Denmark, for example, or anywhere else you may have experience or knowledge?
It's not very common. Of course, we have countries within the EU that has already phased out zinc oxide. We have to learn from those countries. We have to collaborate with those countries. As I mentioned, 5 to 10% of the farms in Denmark are successfully doing this currently. That is probably the farms where it has been easier for them. It's always easier to sort of have the first movers, but having to move the majority of producers, that is going to be the big challenge. Sure. And then just a bit of a head up for countries outside the EU. In some countries, also in Asia, that are in some areas densely populated, I have heard discussions about, okay, we need to protect our land, and also in some of those countries, the inclusion of a heavy metal like zinc in the diet. I think that will come on the agenda as well. Perhaps not tomorrow, but then 5 or 10 years down the road.
Sure, it's not limited to a specific geography.
No.
Now, I believe earlier in your remarks, you mentioned that you do not use plasma in the ration, or at least in these studies. Is that correct?
In those studies, we didn't include plasma products, and you can argue that those diets were a bit more rough than what you see in under commercial circumstances. We were also lower in dairy products and what you see under some commercial situations. That was a choice that we took with open eyes, and as I said, we are currently working on okay, how does low protein levels work when we don't have such rough soybean meal based diet.
All right. Thank you for that clarification. Now, what is the best treatment for diarrhea post-wean? And the question here is also about a treatment for respiratory problems post-wean. The conventional formula is antibiotics plus zinc. You've hinted at an evaluation of many different answers and combinations of answers. What is it that really is needed when you see something like that?
Like if you have an acute outbreak of post-weaning diarrhea and an acute outbreak of colibacillosis, then antibiotic treatment is a must. You can't compromise animal welfare by not treating pigs that are sick. In those cases, I think water supplementation works better compared to sort of in-feed antibiotics. But what we're working so hard on is trying not to get into that situation where you have an acute outbreak. If you have an acute outbreak, there's no diet interventions on Earth that will sort of that can solve that. So it's all sort of more prevention, or trying not to get into that situation where you have an acute outbreak.
Yeah, certainly. Prevention is a common thing that we've heard quite often through this series of webinars on antibiotic reduction and past discussions we've held at BIOMIN. So that's absolutely something that I can confirm we hear quite often as being one of the keys, prevention, before you get to the point where you need treatment. We have questions about specific tools, let's say additives for prevention. Swine acidifiers, are they able to replace zinc oxide?
As I mentioned, I don't think any feed additive can replace zinc one-to-one, but that being said, acidifiers has proven to prevent or reduce post-weaning diarrhea. We have seen that in research I didn't share with you today. We saw that in the concept set that I showed you, that all concept it included acidifiers. So yes, certainly acidifiers is part of the solution, but I just don't think that is going to be the only sort of tool or the only solution.
Right. We're still on the topic of acids that are quite often used for weaning. Can you speak a bit to the buffer capacity of the stomach? Is there inhibition of cell synthesis of hydrochloric acid in the stomach when you add in a lot of acids, and then afterwards that infringes somehow on the piglet's natural ability to produce this? Or is there, would you recommend using, for example, sodium bicarbonate instead of sodium chloride in a weaner diet?
I certainly wouldn't recommend to use sodium bicarbonate. I don't want to use stuff that can sort of buffer in any way the stomach. The stomach acts as a biological barrier to the gastrointestinal tract, and I know there's a lot of discussion on like the inability of a newly weaned pig to produce enough acids. The capacity of the porcine stomach to produce acids is actually really, really high. So I don't think that we will see any sort of inhibition in that capacity. But if you have pigs that are anorectic or experience anorexia in the immediate post-weaning period, when they start to eat after 1-2 days perhaps, then they can overeat, or sort of that means that there will be there will be food in the stomach at all times. As soon as there's just a little bit of space, they will fill that up with diet, and that means that then in those circumstances you can continuously sort of have a higher pH level in the stomach, making them perhaps more susceptible. But is it then the barrier function of the stomach that is compromised, or is it simply because of the nutritional flow into an intestine where you have villosides that has been compromised, etc.? That's really hard to differentiate.
Sure.
From a physiological point of view, the ability of the stomach to produce enough acids should be there.
Okay. And we can see with a third one on the acids topic before we move on. What's your opinion of water acidification?
I think that works really well. Of course, you have to, as always, when you add stuff to the water, you have to be careful that you don't sort of compromise palatability of the water, or in any way sort of compromise water intake. But acidification, as long as it's legal, of course, that the product has been approved. I think that's certainly part of the solution as well.
Great. Now, going back to one of the set of experiments where you shared with the levels of protein with us in the 3 phases, when you talk about compensating a first stage at low protein by higher protein in the perhaps second and third stage in order to obtain the same growth rate, are you concerned about, again, having any E. coli problems around 20 to 25 kilograms of body weight? Is that something that could creep up, or any certain other issues that may be of concern?
That is always an issue, and as I showed you, sort of like following the diarrhea pattern over the nursery period. Yes, we tend to focus a lot on the immediate post-weaning period, but that's only part of the problem. Of course, if we in the post-weaning period has an acute outbreak, we can see high losses. Perhaps the losses are when they get diarrhea later on, we don't see losses, but performance that is compromised. All the pigs are larger, heavier, meaning that you need even more antibiotics to treat them at that time point. So yes, it's always a balance. It's a trade-off.
Absolutely. Do you have any experience or are you familiar with using fermented rapeseed to replace zinc oxide?
There's a company working with those products. We have We have applied for funding together with that company to do research with them. Unfortunately, we haven't been successful so far. So we don't have sort of in-house research with those products, but there's research, there's ongoing research in other countries, and some of that looks promising or interesting.
Okay, great. Again, on an ingredient question, what about soya in diets? Have you done any trials or familiar with anyone who's looked at reducing the amount of soya in diets and increasing more digestible, also potentially more expensive raw materials?
As I said, that is ongoing research at the moment. The pigs are eating, so to speak, in these days. Our research facility. So far, I have to be honest to say that there's this sort of perception that feeding a lot of soybean meal that will lead to more diarrhea. So far, we haven't really seen that on our research facility or on the commercial farm, and we have conducted our research. But we are very much aware of that discussion, and we are currently working with that. It's too early to share that information.
Okay, well, we will stay tuned. We look forward to hearing more about that in the future. Can you speak to the availability of iron sources in diets and iron levels in pigs and how that plays a role here?
Well, we know that sort of low iron levels or low iron status that can compromise hemoglobin levels in piglets, and we know that if you have a low hemoglobin situation or low hem levels, that will make a pig more susceptible to an infection, and a pig that is more susceptible and for an infection is more likely to need antibiotic treatment later on in life. So yes, when you have fast-growing piglets, that can certainly be of an area where you need to pay attention. But that being said, sort of by just including more iron in the diet, it's actually pretty hard to change through the diet the iron status of an animal, especially pigs.
Okay. And we are getting close to the end of our time. We're going to try to squeeze in a couple of more questions. And so the next one here states, zinc is a problem, but what about copper, Cu? Should that be a part of the solution, or should that also be phased out? Do you have a view on that?
Well, the European Union has a view on that. So I'm pretty sure that once we solve the zinc oxide issue, there will be pressure on the pork industry, on the pig industry within the EU to reduce copper. That's also why I didn't include sort of high copper levels as part of my solution, because yes, that would work, but it's not a tool that will be available to us. So yes, that's coming down the road. I think we have a bigger challenge by phasing out zinc oxide without seeing an increase in antibiotic usage. So yeah, one problem at a time, I'd like to say, but it's that will keep us busy. That will keep us in business. That's good.
I will say there's plenty more.
That was a joke. It's going to be a challenge down the road, definitely.
Sure. Absolutely. And like you say, one challenge at a time. There's certainly a lot to do, and we conduct these sorts of activities and appreciate your input in order to help the industry move forward in progressing along that path to phasing out zinc oxide. One last question for you today before we have to say goodbye. Could you give some background, explain the aims of the Avant project, which Avant stands for Alternatives to Veterinary Antimicrobials?
Yes, certainly. That's an EU project that is starting this year, and as you mentioned, the aim of that project is to find substitutions antibiotics in food animals, and your BIOMIN is participating in that EU project. SEGES is participating. I think it's a very interesting project. Yes, it's just starting up, but I think there's going to be some really interesting, excellent research coming out. Research takes time, so in 2 or 3 years' times, I think there'll be some really interesting. I hope there'll be some really interesting results coming out of that project. That's why we invest in it. That's why we're using the money of the Danish pig producers in that project.
Absolutely, and that has started this year. That project, as you mentioned, is running for the next 5 years, I believe.
Yes.
We hope that helps contribute to addressing this problem, to help define those solutions to post-weaning diarrhea, to also being part of that zinc oxide replacement discussion. So,
certainly,
Dr. Hansen, Dr. Fink Hansen, I want to thank you for your remarks today. I want to thank our audience also for their attention, for their questions and participation. Right before we part ways, I want to just show you that the antibiotic reduction expert series continues over the course of the summer. If you haven't yet checked it out, please have a look. In June and July, there are further topics interesting for the pig and pork producers regarding microbiome and welfare topics. So we hope that you're able to join us. Look for those email invitations, and the registration options will be coming up soon. Now that our session is ended, I want to ask just one thing of our live audience. Please go ahead and take the opportunity as soon as this session closes to give us your feedback. So there's a quick survey. It takes 2 minutes to complete. Just share your feedback with those 10 questions to let us know how the session was for you and how we can help improve to make these things valuable for you in the future. So I want to thank you all for joining on behalf of BIOMIN. I wish you a great day and good luck in your zinc replacement efforts.